So hi everyone, my name is Rosie. I'm a master's student at Fitzwilliam College at the University of Cambridge, and today I'm going to be discussing my undergraduate research, which was supervised by Dr. Amy Donovan. So this focused on how memory shaped the response to the 2021 Cumbre Vieja eruption. So specifically memories of an eruption that occurred 50 years previously, the Teneguía eruption. So just an overview of my presentation. I'm firstly going to talk about the context in which this research came about, before moving on to my research questions, and then my methodology. So key to this research is that I wanted to take a multidisciplinary approach, which has been quite difficult, but I mainly drew theories and different lenses from cultural geography. So next, I'll discuss my results based on my 3 research questions. So how was Teneguía remembered? How did these memories affect people's response? And then kind of looking towards the future, how will the 2021 eruption be remembered? And then finally, I'll touch on future directions of research. So this is mainly my MPhil thesis, which is currently being supervised by Professor Clive Oppenheimer, and my hopes for kind of PhD research in the future. So a bit about the background. So the eruption started on the 19th of September 2021. So this was a fissure eruption that began at the northern end of the Cumbre Vieja rift zone in La Palma. So I travelled to La Palma during the 2nd week of the eruption. It was kind of ad hoc and completely unplanned. So the night before I travelled to La Palma, I called Amy on Teams and said, right, I want to change my dissertation topic, probably much to her dismay. So initially we travelled there to report on the eruption in English because a lot of the reports were in Spanish. So I kind of hectically ran around trying to collect interviews. As someone that kind of self-identifies as did self-identify as a physical geographer, this was kind of getting thrown completely into the deep end of human geography research. So this eruption has been the most destructive eruption on historical record in La Palma and has been labelled a so-called urban eruption. And the social impacts of this eruption were completely unprecedented by local people, but also authorities and volcanologists. And this is mainly because a lot of people were expecting another Teneguía eruption. And whilst I was over there and also in the media, so by talking to people, there was a clear comparison being made between the 1971 eruption and this eruption. So therefore, it kind of got me thinking, okay, how can I turn this comparison into a piece of research? And I'd also kind of like to situate this research in wider calls in the disaster risk reduction research community to include more social science in volcanic hazard management. What's also been quite interesting about this research and the context is that La Palma has a very unique cultural history in comparison to the other Canary Islands. So on the other islands, you have like a history of banana plantations and banana farming. So let's take Tenerife, for example. They've sold a lot of their land to the tourism industry, whereas in La Palma, banana farming and banana plantations still contribute as the biggest contributor to the local economy. And therefore, this creates a very unique relationship to the land. So if you own a banana plantation, it's kind of seen as a way to provide for your children's future, to provide an education. So therefore, you have this very strong connection and sense of place in La Palma compared to the other Canary Islands. So whilst I was over there and as I was kind of getting interviews in, I decided to come up with the kind of brief research question of how does memory affect response to volcanic crises? So I came up with 3 research questions, and when devising these, I tried to think about the kind of process of remembering. So I firstly wanted to look at the past. So I wanted to know, okay, how was Teneguía remembered? What was people's thoughts and feelings about this eruption? And then moving towards the present, what was the role of memory in the community response? How are people drawing on these memories of the previous eruption, and has that influenced the way that they've responded to the eruption? Has it influenced decision-making processes? And then finally, I kind of wanted to conclude with a more kind of forward-looking question. So how will the 2021 eruption be remembered? So I am aware that I wrote my dissertation less than a year after the eruption started. So trying to kind of forecast how it will be remembered is quite difficult. So it's kind of the initial remembering of the eruption. So my methodology, again, I was kind of completely thrown into the deep end of human geography research methods. So I undertook fieldwork during the second week of the eruption, and I decided to use semi-structured interviews to collect data. So these were with local people, volcanologists that were working on the eruptions, and also local politicians. So some of these interviews were collected by GeoTenerife for the Volcano Stories project. If you'd like to know more about that project, I'm going to be stood next to the poster that was produced by Sharon Backhouse and Ben Island in the poster session later on today, so come and chat to me about it. So all my interviews had to be transcribed and translated, which had its own challenges in itself. And once this had been done, I used latent coding analysis. So I read through the interviews and tried to pick out any key themes that came up. So this kind of formed the basis of my analysis. And then I also used discourse analysis of newspaper articles that commemorated the Teneguía eruption. So it was the 50th anniversary whilst the 2012 eruption was ongoing. If I was to kind of say what is discourse analysis, I think it's quite an open-ended question and everyone kind of has their own definition, but it's trying to look at texts to try and figure out what meaning they impart. So I firstly, this is an example of a text that I looked at. So I kind of highlighted any explicit indications of memories of the Teneguía eruption. And then I used more of a literary approach to discourse analysis. So I wanted to look at things such as metaphors, similes, semantic fields, and how that created like memories and how it portrayed experience of the Teneguía eruption. Key to this research at the forefront of my mind during the entire project was the ethical side of the project and my own positionality as a British outsider to the community. And I'd say it was probably one of the biggest challenges of this research project. It was very difficult to hear different stories, very traumatic stories, and trying to figure out the best way to portray those stories. You know, I've been trusted with someone's experience, so how do I best portray that in my research? So as I said, I mainly wanted to draw from cultural geography. And I firstly took some inspiration from two previous studies within disaster risk reduction, Longer 2019 and Madsen and O'Mullen 2013. So these looked at memory in response to different types of disasters and kind of concluded that vulnerability and memory are linked. So as memory fades, communities become more vulnerable. And memories of previous disasters is key to developing coping strategies to cope with future disasters and to learn from previous disasters. I also then kind of went very into human geography and looked at Edward Said and Stephen Legg's work as memory as a social process. And this became quite key as it explores memory and its links to identity, nationalism and authority. I also looked at Pierre Nora's work, which looks at sites of memory. So these can be material and also non-material. So material sites are kind of memorials, museums, anything physically in the landscape that memorializes something. And then non-material sites of memory can be more intangible, so kind of identity, any like events of commemoration. And then I wanted to look at collective memory, which is kind of key for community response. So how does a community remember a disaster? And then it was also important to distinguish between remembering and forgetting, and to highlight that forgetting isn't just the opposite of remembering. It is an active process in itself, and different memories are excluded to kind of fit a certain agenda. So my first research question, how was Teneguía remembered? So it was a fissure eruption that began on the 26th of October, following around 3 months of seismic activity. And this was at the southern end of the Cumbre Vieja rift zone near a town of Fuencaliente, which was sparsely populated at the time. So the eruption lasted for 24 days and was mainly described as a spectacle or a fiesta by interviewees, but also within the literature. So on the left-hand side here, you can see a photo that was taken at the time of people on a nearby mountain watching the eruption unfold. People told me how they would take picnics there. And one man told me a story that he thought all of the pigs in the island had run away because everyone was kind of killing them to eat them for all these parties that they were having, which is quite interesting. So the Teneguía eruption was named the friendly volcano, mainly because of what it gave to the island. It brought a lot of tourism into the island at the time, as everyone kind of wanted to come and watch this eruption because you could watch it safely. And it's also important to question who remembers and what is that narrative that is then created. So there obviously is a generational difference in that older people are more likely to have lived through this eruption and therefore have kind of stronger memories. And then the younger generation are relying on indirect experience, so memories that are passed down. But also the fact that you have an official remembering, so the kind of how the authorities in the island remember the eruption, how many deaths that they count, how many the impacts that and facts and figures that they publish, but also how local people remember. And what you kind of find is that sometimes they can be quite different. So coming back to the idea of sites of memory, the Teneguía eruption site is a UNESCO World Heritage Site and is sort of preserved in the landscape. And next door to it, there is a museum that kind of commemorates different eruptions that have happened in the Palma and also the wider volcanic history of the Canary Islands. So this was very interesting to kind of understand how preserving this site then affects how it is remembered. So it's not only kind of remembered in the physical landscape, also by visiting that site, you're kind of learning more about the eruption, you're having an indirect experience of the eruption. And then coming on to non-material sites of memory, I found that previous volcanic eruptions in La Palma are preserved in the Palmero identity, so the identity of the people of La Palma. So I was told that they kind of had this strong sense of identity of overcoming, of a marriage to the earth. They build their banana plantations on top of old lava flows, and it's very much a part of their history, a part of their way of life. Their parents overcame eruptions, their grandparents did, their great-grandparents. So I wanted to kind of understand how the eruption has been preserved in identity in that way and what the implications are for responding to future hazards. So what was the role of memory in community response to the 2021 eruption? So it was quite clear within interviews and also within the literature that local people did draw upon direct and indirect experience of Teneguía, and also some older members of the community drew upon experiences of the 1949 San Juan eruption. And within newspaper articles, there was a strong sense of like a theme of experience that came out. But it was noted that there was a generational difference. So the mayor of El Paso in a newspaper article kind of stated that from knocking on doors, he'd understood that the older generation were a lot less scared compared to the younger generation. And whilst we were in La Palma, we saw one older man who had refused to evacuate because he kind of thought, well, you know, I've done this before, I've been here, and last time it didn't cause any damage, so therefore I'm not going to evacuate. What was quite key that came out of this research is that there was a comparison made between the two eruptions, and I concluded that this almost enhanced the traumatic nature of the 2021 eruption. So if you're comparing memories of like almost fond memories of a past eruption that you visited and it's the kind of a fond childhood memory to the destruction that was ongoing, the very traumatic nature of this eruption, you weren't as prepared for almost the psychological impact as you thought. And so there was a lot of comparison in the literature when I kind of looked at literary devices between the so-called friendly volcano that people identified with and related with. And when the 2021 eruption was described, there was kind of metaphors of hell. It was described as the mouth of hell. One person said that they didn't identify with it because of the destruction that was caused. So there was two very different kind of rememberings of the eruption and comparison being made. And as I said, past eruptions had been embedded within the Palmero identity. So I decided and concluded that it was a relationship between identity and memory that shaped the response in the end. So people drew upon this identity of overcoming, of comparing themselves to the Canarian pine tree, which can kind of burn on the inside but still live on in the inside, but also drew upon past experiences, whether that's direct or indirect, to respond to the 2021 eruption. However, I'd just like to note that my sample size was quite small due to the nature of the research. So more data is needed to kind of make any clear conclusions. So looking towards the future, how will the 2021 Cumbre Vieja eruption be remembered? So the eruption was declared over on the 25th of December 2021, so on Christmas Day, after a 10-day precautionary period and after 85 days of recovery. However, we must ask, is an eruption ever really over? Just because the volcano has stopped erupting, it doesn't mean that it's over for the people that have lived through it. The social impacts of the eruption are still ongoing, so in total over 7,000 people were evacuated, over 2,000 buildings were destroyed, and a lot of people still don't have access to their homes and are very much living through the psychological trauma caused by this eruption. There was destruction of both the physical landscape by lava flows, but entire towns were lost and entire communities have now been fractured and displaced. So you have destruction within the cultural landscape, and therefore this is going to affect how it is remembered and how that will then affect response to future eruptions, because you have communities that have collective memories have now been fractured and are split across the island. There's been a few acts of memorialisation since the eruption. So naming the eruption was quite controversial. So traditionally, eruptions in the Canary Islands are given watershed names. So the kind of indigenous population to the Canary Islands. And it took a while for the name to be decided on, and it is still kind of controversial. It depends who you ask, if they kind of accept that name or if they don't accept that name. There's also been controversy around making the eruption a geosite. So people still don't have access to their homes. And in comparison to Teneguía, which is more a kind of positive eruption, if you say, this is a very traumatic eruption. So therefore, if we remember it in the physical landscape, what impact does this then have? So I'm hoping to kind of look at indirect experience mainly from my MPhil project. And yeah, if you'd like to know more about that, come chat to me, because I think I've run out of time. But thank you so much.